Berlin, April 30th, 1945. 9 meters below the ruined Reich Chancellery garden, the air tastes of diesel fumes and damp concrete. Above ground, the city is dying in real time. Soviet artillery shells fall at a rate of 1 every few seconds, a rhythm so constant that those below have stopped flinching at each impact and started listening instead for the ones that land close enough to shake dust from the ceiling. It is shortly after 3 in the afternoon. In a small study off the bunker's lower corridor, a single gunshot is muffled by 2 feet of reinforced concrete and steel. Nobody outside the room reacts immediately. There has been so much noise, so much death, that one more shot barely registers. When the door is finally opened, the man who spent 12 years remaking Europe in his own image is found slumped on a sofa, a pistol on the floor beside him. Beside him, his wife of less than 40 hours lies dead from cyanide. The Thousand Year Reich has lasted 12 years, 3 months, and 8 days, and its founder has just ended it with a single bullet rather than face capture. This is the story of the Führerbunker in its final hours, the small city carved into the earth beneath Berlin, and the last, chaotic, often absurd human drama that played out inside it as an empire collapsed above. It matters not because of what was built there, but because of what it reveals, how power behaves in its dying moments, how loyalty curdles into fanaticism or flees into self-preservation, and how the machinery of one of history's most destructive regimes finally, mercifully, ground to a halt. By the spring of 1945, Berlin was a city already defeated in every sense except the formal one. The Red Army had spent nearly 4 years advancing from Stalingrad, and the final push, the Battle of Berlin, involved something in the region of 2.5 million Soviet soldiers converging on the capital. German defenses, by contrast, were a patchwork of exhausted Wehrmacht remnants, teenage Hitler Youth conscripts, and elderly Volkssturm militia armed with whatever could be found. Estimates suggest fewer than 100,000 defenders remained to hold a city of over 3 million people, many of them civilians with nowhere left to flee. The existing command structure, built for conquest rather than defense, simply could not cope. Communication lines had collapsed. Fuel had run dry. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, could barely put aircraft into the air over its own capital. The problem facing Hitler and his inner circle was not merely military. It was a problem of denial colliding with physics. Orders were still being issued for divisions that no longer existed, for counterattacks that no unit had the strength to mount. Hitler continued, in the underground map room, to move markers representing armies that had already been destroyed or had never existed in the numbers claimed. This was not simply stubbornness. It reflected a deeper crisis, a command system so thoroughly built around one man's will that when reality diverged from his expectations, the system had no mechanism to correct course. Nobody dared tell him the truth in full, and those who tried, like General Alfred Jodl, found themselves shouted down in scenes that staff officers later described as among the most disturbing of the entire war. The challenge, in short, was not how to win. Everyone in that bunker, except perhaps Hitler himself, understood the war was lost. The challenge was how to survive the collapse of a belief system that had no framework for defeat. The Führerbunker itself was not a single structure but 2, joined together and built in phases. The older Führerbunker had been completed in 1936 as a temporary air raid shelter beneath the old Reich Chancellery. The newer, deeper Führerbunker was added in 1943 and 1944 under the direction of architect Albert Speer's office, sitting some 8.5 meters underground beneath 4 meters of concrete, itself topped with 3 meters of earth. To put that in perspective, the roof alone was roughly as thick as a double-decker bus is tall, designed to withstand a direct hit from the largest conventional bombs the Allies were then dropping. Inside, the complex ran to around 30 rooms across 2 levels, connected by a narrow staircase, with a diesel generator providing electricity and a well providing water, since the city's main supply had long since failed. Life inside was claustrophobic in every sense. Corridors were barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. The air, recycled through a ventilation system straining under constant use, carried the permanent smell of diesel exhaust, damp plaster, and unwashed bodies, since bathing water was rationed. Secretaries who worked there later described the walls as sweating with condensation, and the constant thud of artillery above, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough to sway the light fixtures, became the involuntary soundtrack to daily life. Hitler kept largely nocturnal hours by this point, holding situation conferences that stretched past midnight, meaning the bunker's small staff, adjutants, secretaries, telephone operators, and a rotating handful of senior officers existed on a schedule divorced entirely from daylight, which none of them saw for weeks at a stretch. The organization of daily existence fell to people whose names rarely appear in the grand narratives of the war. Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's private secretaries, was 25 years old and had been hired less than 3 years earlier with almost no vetting beyond a shorthand test. She, along with fellow secretary Gerda Christian, typed dictation, managed correspondence, and in the final days found herself present for conversations of extraordinary historical weight simply because she happened to be in the room. The kitchen was run by a cook named Constanze Manziarli, tasked with producing meals from steadily dwindling supplies for a leader who, by this stage, subsisted mainly on a vegetarian diet, supplemented by medication administered by his personal physician, Theodore Morell, whose injections of amphetamines, barbiturates, and a cocktail of other substances have led some historians to question how much Hitler's physical and mental deterioration by 1945 owed to Parkinson's-like symptoms and how much to the drugs meant to treat them. Deployment of what remained of German command authority from the bunker in its final fortnight was, by any measure, an exercise in controlled disintegration. On April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, senior figures including Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels made what would be their final visits to the bunker before scattering to pursue their own survival strategies, several of which involved secretly attempting to negotiate surrender terms behind Hitler's back. When Hitler learned of Göring's attempt to assume leadership, believing Hitler incapacitated or trapped, he expelled him from the party in a fury witnesses described as among the most violent they had seen. Himmler's parallel attempt to open surrender talks with the Western Allies through Swedish intermediary Count Folke Bernadotte was, if anything, treated as an even greater betrayal once confirmed by BBC radio broadcast, received in the bunker itself. The psychological effect on Hitler was, according to multiple accounts from those present, more devastating than news of any battlefield defeat. Records of exactly what was said in the ensuing confrontations remain incomplete, pieced together largely from post-war testimony of survivors, and some details, inevitably, may have been colored by hindsight or self-interest in the retelling. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is worth pausing to compare this collapse with how other Axis and Allied command structures met their endings, because the contrast is instructive. Mussolini's fall came from without, seized by partisans while attempting to flee to Switzerland, his death on April 28th, a public, almost theatrical execution, followed by the display of his body in a Milan square. There was no bunker, no controlled final act, only capture and summary justice. Japanese command structure, by contrast, largely persisted through hierarchy even after the atomic bombings, with Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast on August 15th representing an institutional decision rather than a personal collapse. American and British command, of course, never faced this scenario at all, operating from secure, functioning capitals throughout. What made the Berlin bunker unique was the combination of physical entombment with psychological unraveling, a command structure that remained nominally intact on paper while its actual authority evaporated day by day, its orders reaching fewer and fewer units capable of executing them. Roughly 200 people are estimated to have sheltered in and around the bunker complex at its peak occupancy in the final days, a number that shrank steadily as officers slipped away to attempt escape through Soviet lines, a gamble that for many proved fatal and for a handful remarkably succeeded. The events of 29th and 30th April compressed into roughly 36 hours what might, in less desperate circumstances, have unfolded over months. Shortly after midnight on the 29th, Hitler married his long-term companion Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony conducted in the map room, witnessed by Goebbels and Martin Bormann. He then dictated both his personal and political testaments to Traudl Junge, a process that reportedly took several hours and left her, by her own later account, emotionally numb rather than moved. So exhausted was she by the surrounding chaos. The political testament blamed the war on international Jewry and expelled both Göring and Himmler from the party, while naming Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as head of state. News arrived that evening of Mussolini's execution and the public mutilation of his body, information that appears to have hardened Hitler's resolve to avoid capture at any cost. On the afternoon of April 30th, with Soviet troops reportedly within a few hundred meters of the Chancellery, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to his study. Around 3:30, a single shot was heard. When Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, and others entered moments later, they found Hitler dead from a gunshot wound and Braun dead beside him, having taken cyanide. The bodies were carried up the emergency exit into the Chancellery garden, doused in petrol from cans that staff had been collecting for days in anticipation of exactly this need, and burned in a shell crater as Soviet artillery continued to fall nearby, an act witnessed by a handful of aides who then retreated to the questionable safety of the bunker to report what they had done. The following day brought a second horror. Josef and Magda Goebbels, who had moved into the bunker with their 6 young children, chose to end the children's lives with cyanide before taking their own, an act of murder that remains one of the war's most chilling footnotes, carried out by parents who apparently could not envisage a world for their children without National Socialism in it. Records of the precise sequence and who administered what remain based on the testimony of the few adults present, principally a dentist and members of the SS, and some specific details continue to be debated by historians. What survives of the physical bunker today is remarkably little, and this itself tells a story about how post-war authorities chose to handle the site. Soviet forces who captured Berlin explored and documented the bunker extensively in the weeks after the war, removing items and photographing rooms that would later inform much of the world's understanding of Hitler's final days. East German authorities, wary of the site becoming a shrine for neo-Nazi pilgrimage, demolished much of the structure in stages, particularly in 1947, and again more thoroughly in the 1980s during construction work in the area, which had by then become part of the death strip along the Berlin Wall. Today, the location, in the Mitte district near the intersection of Wilhelmstrasse and in den Ministergarten, sits beneath what is now residential apartment blocks and a car park, marked only since 2006 by a modest German-language information board erected ahead of the World Cup that Germany hosted that year, a deliberately understated acknowledgement that stands in stark contrast to the historical weight of what occurred beneath it. The legacy of those final hours is less about the bunker as a physical space than about what its collapse represented. It marked the definitive end of the Nazi state's claim to legitimate authority, even though pockets of resistance and the Rump-Donitz government would formally negotiate surrender only days later on May 8th. Psychologically, the manner of Hitler's death, by his own hand rather than capture or battlefield death, denied the Allies the trial and public reckoning many had hoped for, a fact that arguably fed decades of conspiracy theories about his possible survival, theories comprehensively disproven by forensic examination of remains recovered by Soviet forces, including dental records matched against Hitler's own dentist's charts. The bunker's story has since become a fixture of historical documentary and dramatization, most notably through the 2004 film Downfall, which drew heavily on Traudl Junge's own memoir and brought the claustrophobic, increasingly surreal atmosphere of those final days to a global audience, for many of whom it remains their primary point of reference for how the war in Europe actually ended. 9 meters of earth and concrete once separated a dying regime from a city being pounded into rubble above it. Down there, in rooms with sweating walls and air thick with diesel fumes, an empire that had swallowed most of a continent narrowed, hour by hour, into a handful of exhausted people arguing in a bunker, while a war they had already lost continued to kill thousands a day above their heads. What ended on April 30th, 1945, was not simply one man's life. It was the final, physical proof that the ideology built around him could not survive contact with the reality it had spent 12 years denying. The bunker held out longer than the myth did. By the time Hitler raised the pistol to his own temple, the myth of invincibility had already been dead for years, buried somewhere between Stalingrad and the Rhine, and all that remained was for the man to catch up with it. Berlin fell 4 days later. The war in Europe ended 9 days after that, and the small, suffocating rooms beneath the Chancellery garden, rooms that no longer physically exist, remain one of history's starkest lessons in how absolute power, when finally cornered, chooses annihilation over accountability.